それでは次にハーバード大学 T.H チャン公衆衛生大学院武見国際保健プログラム事務局長のジェシー・バンプ先生よりご講演をお願いいたします。バンプ先生は武見フェローであられまして、現在武見プログラムにおいて現役武見フェローの研究支援指導をされております。本日は地域医療の最前線でイノベーションによる前進と状況による制約と題してご講演をお願いしています。それではバンプ先生、Dr. Bump, please start.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming. I'd like to begin by thanking our longtime partners in the JMA and the Takumi Family Foundation for co-hosting this event with us. And I'd like to recognize Japan's culture of politeness by giving you a short version of what I have to say in case you'd like to go do something else before the break. And it is a very simple message. It's that technology has changed almost everything, including the community. But when we talk about communities and health, we tend not to factor in how communities have changed. We just talk about how technology has changed the way we're delivering health, and that we need to update that. So that's it. If you need to take a nap, if you're sleepy like me, you can do so. If you'd like to have a coffee, you may. And if you're curious, you can stay around, and we'll go through each of these points with a little bit more detail, and we'll play a couple of games, okay? So this is our outline. First, technology changes almost everything, but that change has been very hard to forecast in the past. And I'll show you some examples of how people have attempted to forecast that maybe some worked and some didn't. Then I'll show you what community is and give you some of its dimensions, and I'll show you how technology has changed each of those. And then I'll ask some questions about how we're conceptualizing communities and how that will need to change if we're going to deliver on community health. So does anyone know what this is? Has anyone seen that before? One or two? Yeah. Back in the time of dinosaurs, when people wanted to make a communication, they had this box, and you'd go inside, and if someone else were near a similar box or had the right technology, if they were near it, they could answer it, and you could speak to them. When I was a little boy, and just after the time of dinosaurs, these were around, and to make a phone call, you'd have to find one, and then go inside it with money, and you'd manipulate it, and you'd make a phone call. Has anyone seen this before? Yeah, Sir Michael has seen a lot of these, reflecting his age and wisdom. Maybe even plain Michael has seen some of these. This is actually one of the early printers, and my family had one of these. It had a disc inside. It was called a daisy wheel, and there was a little spine with a letter on each one. It was like an electric typewriter. That's how you used to print things. And to change the font, you would take the disc out and then put another disc in. It was really special because for the first time, you could change the typeface right there at home. Now, this one has special meaning for me. That's the first computer my family had. And before you ask, on the right side, that is an extra special dual floppy disk drive, so you could copy from one side to the other. That was expensive. I mean, that disk drive alone was over $1,000. That's the Commodore business machine. I think at the dawn of personal computing, it would have been hard for you to imagine what would have come next. And at that time, it seemed like those were miracles. We'll look at one more. I'm not sure. Sir Michael, have you seen one of these? You have. Oh, and plain Michael has seen one. That's a telex. It's like a predecessor to the fax machine. Yeah, it's remarkable. And really large businesses used to own these. There was a network of them worldwide. People don't understand what these are anymore, but they changed the world. This is what the world looks like now. This is young people. They don't use paper money and coins. They don't go to the bank or the post office. They don't talk on the phone. And sometimes they don't even reveal their family names. This is an article I saw in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago, and I'll read to you. One warm summer night, Dana Mushar-Bash was sitting along the Chicago River with a man she had been dating for more than 3 months. As they talked about the future sipping cocktails, he popped the question, "What's your last name?" The world has changed. The world isn't the same one that we might remember from our childhoods. And the world that we live in today is so different from one 10 years ago that it's almost unimaginable. Everything has changed from communications to transportation, the economy, personal and societal health, relationships, both in between people, the relationships between groups, and how people relate to the state. Those have all changed. Even innovation itself has changed, the way we invent things, the way we think about the future. But forecasting has been difficult. And on this point, I'd like to say that when we talk about health, we're talking about first a fundamentally historical process, because that refers to the way people have developed, the status that they have now, the conditions under which they've grown. And when we're intervening, we're really talking about the future, because we want them to be better. In this sense, forecasting is at the center of health. But let's look at some attempts to imagine the future. This is the future of wildlife, as seen in the 1950s and 60s. For those of you who are not familiar with Godzilla, he's an ancient sea monster who evolved with capacities to live on land, and he was sleeping happily underwater in the Indian Ocean until he was disturbed by nuclear testing. And then he woke up and he was angry. This is an attempt to imagine what the future of wildlife would be like in the nuclear age. In 1900, at the World's Fair in Paris, they conducted an exercise where people tried to imagine life in the year 2000. And I'll show you a couple of these. So this is a prediction that might have come true, but it was toward the year 2000, 18 years ago now. And it's showing you the future of fishing. It's not even intuitive what's happening here, but what's going on is these people are wearing a kind of underwater breathing equipment, and they're floating bait on the surface, trying to catch the seagulls. When the seagull comes down to eat a piece of floating fish, they pull it underwater, and I guess they grab it. I'm not even sure how this is supposed to work, but this did not really come true as a fishing exercise, although we do have underwater breathing equipment, scuba equipment. Here's another one, the future of transportation. I like this blend of imagination where transportation is happening underwater and people are happy, and something that looks a lot like an old rail coach. And yet you can see the constraint of imagination in the use of a whale as the motive force. It's fun to look at the past. Here's another one. This is the future of computing. This is the Xerox Star in 1981. Star is actually the operating system, but this is one of their early and famous computers. It had a mouse, it had a graphical interface, it was document-centric, it had icons, it had Ethernet networking, and it had the WYSIWYG protocol. That just means what you see is what you get. It's this idea that you'd put something on the screen, and when you print it out, it would look the same. This is one of the most landmark products in the history of personal computing, and Xerox didn't quite know how to make it work, and they left the computer market in 1985. That was not a great decision, but Apple took all those ideas and made the world that you have today. The phones that you have and stuff, those aren't even 10 years old. So when you think about individual and collective change through this lens, the future is often imagined as things that individuals might do, but the big changes are collective, not about what one of us does, but what we all do. So the fact that all of us have smartphones, or many of us do, it means there's almost zero cost communication. The first time I came to Japan back in 1988, phone calls between the US and Japan were $2 per minute. You can now talk all day and not pay anything. It's remarkable how things have changed. The low cost of communication, the wearable activity and health monitors that many people have, they unlock new ways of thinking about health, and there are also new ways of constituting communities, which we'll get to in a minute. With new innovation, we've also changed the way people live. We augment people's bodies in ways that make them behave better. So whether that's for eyesight, fertility control, organ replacement, there are many examples how technology has changed individuals and the collective. So let me leave this for a second and ask about what defines a community. Quite simply, in linguistic terms, a community is some social unit that has something in common. So as someone who teaches for a living, I know that when the community of the classroom starts to fall apart, people will get out their phones and join some other community without moving at all. These could be defined in geography, so people living near one another, by language or ethnicity, by experience, such as the shared experiences, survivors of war, graduates from schools, or things like that. They might be defined by disease or risk factors. Community can be often defined by employment, whether people are employed or not employed, or whether by a company, an industry, or something like that. It might be defined by age, children, singles, couples, parents, the elderly. And sometimes community is defined by habits, behaviors, and preferences. Mentions, technology has changed things. So first I'll show you an old community, and then I'll talk about how each of these has changed under technology. This is a version of Community 1.0. This is a village down in the southern part of Japan, looking a lot like it did for hundreds or thousands of years. People lived near one another. Geography was a main determinant of community. People had similar experiences, similar languages and ethnicities, similar habits, and there was high homogeneity across all the dimensions, or nearly all of the dimensions. So the idea of community is not hard to define, but one way of talking about the inequality mentioned by both types of Michael this morning is to say that inequality is a breakdown of the community, and it's a failure of societies at large. In this sort of community, there isn't so much inequality. In our modern world, it's characterized by inequality. So think of how technology changes the community. It changes the size of social units or groups. It changes the things that they share. It changes the number of communities to which any one person might belong. And it changes our own identities and the way we think about our societies. Geography. This doesn't divide people the same way. I referred to the cost of communication. Transport is another good example. It's much faster, much cheaper, much easier to travel around the world. Geography also doesn't unite us the same way, because inequality has grown so much and physical location is less defining. Ideas travel the world, the private product marketplace has expanded globally, and in general, the powers of globalization mean that geography is much less distinctive than it used to be. In language and ethnicity, learning languages is easier and much more common. There's instant machine translation. Ethnicity is more complex as people move and start new lives. Its meaning is less certain than it used to be, and mixing is far more common than it once was. DNA testing reveals lots of surprises about ethnicity for most people. They realize they have ethnic backgrounds that were unknown to them. Technology has changed all that. In experience, it's constantly changing through innovation. The things that you can experience over the internet or on television or over the radio, if anyone remembers what that is, those are totally different from what they used to be. There's far greater experience. Think of how these have changed even in what we think of as traditional media, where people might have once shared a single radio station or a single television station or even a network of television stations that would broadcast almost the same thing. Now there are hundreds of channels, and the variety available on the internet is almost infinite. So people don't have shared experiences exactly the same way anymore. It raises the question of what is the basis for shared experience. There are also diseases and risk factors. Those are ways of defining communities sometimes. There are many more types and better detection than there used to be. And there's political and economic mobilization around diseases and health because of their economic significance. These are all new things. Then there's employment. The company-employee relationship has changed a lot. The decline of the salaryman in Japan is one example, And more recent ones would refer to the gig economy, where people might work informally for a company like Uber. Are they employed or not employed? It's no longer an easy question. Do the health benefits that used to come through employers apply to people in such jobs? In general, they don't, but it's an open question, and technology changes even work itself. What exactly it is and who does it are questions that many of us ask from people who are making lots of money on the internet or internet-based enterprises. It isn't clear what the values and products are, but employment has just become this much more complicated, and the fluidity of working and not working changes this category of employment altogether. The next one is age. Technology changes the meaning of young and old. It democratizes information and knowledge and upends social structures. It changes physical abilities. It changes the social order of who can say what or who's in what position, who can make much money and who may not. Technology has affected even age, which would seem to be one of the most immutable factors. Technology also changes habits, behaviors, and preferences. So there are more self-identified groups that form over social media and the internet. No matter what obscure interest you may find, there will be a community out there, and it probably has a bulletin board or an email list or a bunch of websites. There are also there's more geographic dispersion. So if your interests are just held by one person in every 5 or 10 or 100,000 or even in one in 1 million people, you'll be able to find others who are in that group with you. The community has changed in these ways. These are profound ways, and we're on the cusp of even more profound shifts in what community means. So I want to ask a few questions. Do we know what communities need? If we're not sure how to define it, do we know what those needs are? Do we know what a community wants? Do we know who's in it? And do we even know where a community is? So health in the 21st century. Here's one exercise. If you want to answer the last questions I was posing, why don't we ask the World Health Organization? A Google search of the World Health Organization and community health will lead you to this page, the top result when I looked last week. It leads you to a page on the management of community health services. You'll notice there in the print under the title, this section is concerned with topics and issues relevant to the organization and management of services that are planned with and provided in the community, not in health facilities. So one definition of communities, according to the World Health Organization, would be that it's not in a health facility. I decided to click these links on the bottom, these shown right here, to see what else there was. The first of these links is publications for frontline managers, and here's a couple. So one is a guide to management in primary healthcare, concepts, definitions, principles, and main functions of management, health team leading, organization and control, and such. The second one is about Healthy Villages, a guide for communities and community health workers, published in 2002. The next page is for higher level managers, so it begins with a paper on results-based logic modeling, includes another one on the guide to developing public health programs. On each of these pages, there's a couple of things. There's probably 3 or 4. There are 3 of these pages, and there's one more page of websites. On the 3 pages, there's a total of 17 published resources. The median and average age of those publications is 2004. The oldest is from 1992, and the youngest is from 2008. So think, just in that time since 2008 or since 2004, think of how many things have changed about the way we live our lives. The phone responsible for so many pictures that you've seen today was likely in almost none of our pockets. The almost free communication that we all enjoy now, that wasn't happening in those days. 2004 is still stuck on the edge, the beginning of the internet before even internet commerce went mainstream. The usage of community health in these pages doesn't reflect the last 40 years of innovation. It's still conceptualized around historic villages, like that Village 1.0 I showed you. And it's still based on fixed community health centers. It's based on the Alma Ata vision that looks like this. the 1978 Primary Healthcare Conference. In this sense, village is a way of talking about the periphery, as if all marginalized people or all unequal settings were easily located that way. The way at one time, maybe they were. But times have changed dramatically, so I want to leave you with a couple conclusions about this. First is that innovation has changed communities, and innovation will continue to change communities. So where you find them is changing. It's no longer in remote villages. That meaning stays the same. So where there are rural remote villages relatively undisturbed by the modern economy and untouched by innovation, you can still find them there. But innovation has touched almost every other population on the planet. At the global level, there's no innovation in the way that we understand or manage community health, and we're not going to maximize community health without understanding how communities have changed. So here are a few suggestions for the road ahead. One is to identify new innovation. Does this mean we partner with industry innovators or technology developers? We work on relationships, networks, and analyses? Does it mean we have strategies to maximize them? It really should. It means we should have our own innovation laboratories where we think about how innovation is changing communities and how we can use that to maximize health, how we can leverage the massive influx, the massive generation coming from wearable technology. Do we think about drone delivery for health purposes? Do we think about implanted diagnostics and reporting? These futures are all coming, and if we're to maximize the benefit for whatever community we're trying to serve, we need to think about these questions. Thank you very much.
バンプ先生どうもありがとうございました。